We're part of a whole webinar series, and inside this webinar series of iSquare, we're going to have a couple of webinars that talk about attention and foundations of eye tracking, and attention is what we'll cover today. And I will give you a bit of an overview first. So the whole iSquare Inside series, the other webinars you can find on our website here, and like I said, we're here in the first section. There's different other topics coming: foresighting, impact of AI, generated advertisement, think fast, faster, or shopper experience sandbox. And my colleagues are going to speak here. What I'm going to speak about is more the general parts of eye tracking and attention research today, and give you an overview about that. So I'm Philip. I'm a partner at iSquare. I've been with iSquare almost from the beginning. I'm a trained psychologist focusing on cognitive science, and that's where eye tracking comes right in. And in the series of the attention webinar series, we'll talk about the foundations today. So what is attention? How do we measure it? And why is it so important, not only to us, also to our clients? And in part two, we'll talk more in depth about the tools actually, and we'll invite guest speakers, so from Pupil Labs and maybe from another of our partners. And so you get a better understanding what state of the art eye trackers are today. And part three, we'll talk about prediction and AI in general. So, of course, LLMs are not that good in predicting eye tracking, but the machine learning algorithms are, and we have a great example of that too with our seal eye tracking. We'll come to that in this session, not so much more in this session, because our algorithm is actually predicting where humans are actually looking in this moment, and the prediction algorithms predict human attention in general, and they're also getting much better and better. And in part four, we have applications where we'll deep dive into real big case studies that we're doing for our clients. So Snapchat, Meta, Screenforce, and all these great cases. We'll probably also have some guest speakers there. And yeah, let's see and discuss today why human visual attention is so important and also so interesting for us to do research on. So at iSquare, we have been doing this research for a long time, and the very first stages of human information processing, the perception, is for us always a prerequisite for all other coming behaviors. So emotion, behavior, cognition. And since attention is such a general topic and so important, it's actually also is in our brain. And there's so many statistics and sayings. So I'll just put a sum together. These relevant ones for us. So what people say they saw is not what they actually looked at. That's a very common thing in research. That our rationale is limited of what we're actually processing. So it's a very nice and objective measure for us. We have our research where we can say how much average attention does an ad actually get. So 2 to 3 seconds is the average if you compare all advertisements. A lot of times it is a lot shorter. Our brain is basically processing visual perception, visual information the whole time anyways, where we live in a very visual society, of course. And so researchers argue if it's like half of the brain that's just doing visual processing, or if it's just a third, and large parts of visual information goes unnoticed. Here also research is divided. Some say it's actually more than half that we don't see, and you all know these little experiments where human blind sight has been shown. And what comes to our consciousness is definitely small. How much is unconsciously processed can be discussed, and you all know these sayings as well. And I would just put them here to get you into the right mood, to get you your attention here. So seeing is believing is a saying we have all heard a lot of times. What you see is what you get. eyes don't lie, pictures worth 1,000 words. Eyes are the window to our soul. That's actually physiologically also true because our eyes are part of our brain. So by nature, that's how it grew, I believe. It when I see it. These are citations, or basically they're just sayings that we use in general life. And if we go to business and research, there's also a lot of them. Attention is the new currency. What gets seen gets remembered, first seen, first considered, unseen is unsold. I think that's actually eye tracking research, like from an eye tracking research paper. No attention, no action. The eye leads, the mind follows. And the eye lead is a good keyword because research is still not 100% aligned on how we can predict where the eye will jump next. We're pretty good in predicting the overall eye tracking, like a heat map, where will people probably look at, but it's very difficult to predict what's my next fixation. And these processes, they're sub or pre-conscious, and of course, what I will look at, I can process. So this is kind of where the mind follows, and these citations show us how deeply vision and attention is incorporated in our everyday life. Why we want to talk about eye tracking and why it gives us so much insight. There's basically three areas that we can talk about. The understanding of attention is very deep. You can draw a lot of information out of it. The data is rather trustworthy because we can measure it very precisely, and it adds a lot of business value if you do it in the right way and if you do it in the right research projects. Of course, not all research projects need eye tracking. And so these are the three dimensions. And sorry, this animation, I'll just skip. So the deep understanding is what eye tracking reveals. So seeing through somebody's eyes, if you really look at a single gaze replay, is very interesting. It shows us pre-conscious processes. It actually is a way of building empathy in a way. If you think of user experience and of taking somebody else's perspective, it shows us these pre-conscious processes. We don't remember exactly where we looked at. Also reveals this gap in between what people state they saw and what they think they saw, and kind of also captures these very early processes. So when the eye jumps around, it's kind of pre-conscious and also shows what was missed and what was not seen. That's sometimes even more interesting. And it can uncover the why behind behavioral data, either if we ask real questions or if we design a good experiment. And it reveals the sequence, and that's important. The first 2 or 3 stops of the eye in the first 2 or 3 seconds, that's what we focus on a lot. And trustworthiness, yeah, why stakeholders believe in it. It is objective, so there's no doubt that the eye can be measured, and our focal point of vision is so small that I know when the eye moved here that I could have at least processed the information there. The data is easy to understand, so there's no need to explain a heat map in depth. It doesn't need like statistical understanding for that. No, subject to recall, bias, post hoc rationalization, measure of behavior. That's a behavioral measure. Provides quantifiable, comparable metrics. Yes, replicable, so we can do it again and can standardize it. That's also an interesting matter if we look at the definition of it. And in the US and also now in Germany, there's a lot of attention boards and communities that will actually define what attention is. Is it enough if I just measure the head, or if I should measure the eyes? Well, it's pretty clear that the eye and eye tracking at least make sense to measure. Reminds us to treat attention respectfully. Yeah, sometimes we forget how scarce and how vulnerable attention is. So it does remind us that the eye is very easily distractible because we are, as humans, also part of the big animal kingdom. And if something moves, I'll have to look there. And yeah, That's a good point. The practical ROI, so the business value, it can identify problems, barriers, can prevent wasteful spending. So if something really does not work, maybe then we should not put it on our design or change the advertisement. Problem barriers, we have seen that one before. It de-risks creative decisions before launch, reduces iterations, validates um, assumptions, shortens time to insight, and can increase the confidence in decisions. So that's also why we do eye tracking research. Sometimes maybe just once a year with a client, but it certainly is a great data source to learn from. So what we do at iSquare, we do it in these different fields. So this is just how our teams are organized. In brand and media research, we do a lot of eye tracking because we pre-test a lot of ad types, and we also measure across different channels. Here, it's interesting to understand how ads really work. For some research, of course, in media, I don't need the eye tracking because we measure the behavior pretty detailed already. And shopper research, on the other hand, is a very classical eye tracking research fields because of the shelf and the standout. So eye tracking here has numerous great studies and benchmarks. And nowadays we of course focus a lot also on the e-com world with eye tracking. In UX, eye tracking is used a bit differently, mainly qualitatively, which also helps a lot to understand how prototypes work. And if you do it more quantitatively, then of course you don't do it on a prototype anymore. But since the days of online interviews, it has reduced a bit. But here there's also advances of how you could maybe see my eye tracking now live while we're speaking. And we'll dive into these different sections and the applications where eye tracking is really being used in the later sessions. So at iSquare, we have been doing eye tracking in all of these blue countries, sometimes on the ground with eye trackers that are like head mounted like glasses, sometimes, just through webcams or our smartphones, or actually in labs in our research facilities or the research facilities of our partners. And generally, we do not only record eye tracking, that's something we would not recommend for sure. We would always recommend the kind of triangulation of measuring perception in a rather natural situation, as natural as it can get in a lab or in a research, but most of our participants now are at home anyway, so we try to control the environment and run an experiment online. Then we could measure the emotions or associations at least after or during the experiment, and we also want to measure the effect, so what people actually remember, what they think, and what they would to recommend. And then the eye tracking also comes then into play in the holistic view. So these experimental environments, how we conduct eye tracking, if we just show pictures or if we actually give people more control, that's a very interesting thing to discuss. That's where we, as applied research, would always argue that it makes sense to do very natural eye tracking research, but then it also gets very complex to analyze it. And yeah, these implicit methods, eye tracking is one of them, right? So there's also a lot of other implicit measures, but we'll focus on that today. And sorry, I didn't turn off my Teams here. So here we go. And these are just some examples of our eye tracking. So I'll go through them one by one. You'll see head-mounted eye tracking here, somebody sitting in a car trying to solve a problem. You see social media sites here in our experimental and context environments, and classical print eye tracking with a person sitting in front of a computer here. So this is a lab study using a desktop eye tracker, then aggregated eye tracking on a TV spot. So each blue spot actually is a person here, and leaving a heat map. Up here in the middle now, you see how 100 people look at a virtual shelf or shelf in general. In this case, it's with sweets, and you see how the attention is being distributed and how fast the attention also evolves. Shopping, I already said before, is a very common thing. Here you see how the faces are blurred by the pupil algorithm. So the data protection is also working now. A calibration check has been made, and then a shopping task would be that people go through the shop, and we're normally just focusing on one shelf or one section, but so that it's a experiment. People don't know what their point of interest it is. So we say buy shampoo, buy different products, and then we'll in depth just analyze one of these shelves. And yeah, here in the middle there you see the eye tracking on the smartphone. This is also interesting for us, especially when there's so much information being processed, like here in the e-commerce world. And we'll show more of these examples then in the following sessions where we deep dive into these. So what we do is a bit of a theory part, and defining attention is tricky. We'll start with William James, like 130 years ago. He said, everyone knows what attention is: focalization, concentration of consciousness. It's of its essence. It applies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. So he got it pretty much right. So many years ago, because he basically said you have a focal point and you cannot focus on everything. And so that's a pretty good definition. What he also said is that attention is selective. So I have to concentrate on something. I can't look at two things at the same time, really. And it's finite, so our resources are not infinite. I can only see and remember so many things, like our short-term memory is very restricted. So you can pretty much remember a phone number. That's why they made them 7 digits or 8 digits long, because you're able to remember that for a couple of minutes, but not much longer. And it's voluntary. And voluntary means I can also decide what I want to look at. So that's why attention is so difficult also to explain. It's on the one hand, it's automated. On the other hand, it's voluntary, and it's being affected by a lot of different things. So one more recent definition by Posner and Peterson in this case, they say attention is actually a system. So it's not one part of the brain doing this, and it's like the whole brain. Attention is carried out by a network of anatomical areas. It's neither a property of a single center or a general function of the brain. It's more a system, and the system is actually has 3 dimensions. It's for alerting us if something, moving somewhere, let's say on the ceiling or outside, like I have to look at it right away. It's for orientation, and it's also for executive control, so resolving conflict, managing competing responses. So my attention can also be managed. When you're driving, you know that you can't look at the display or the phone all the time. And there's also some other things that makes us special compared, let's say, to the others in nature, because our human eye has one special characteristic to it. And first, even if we talk to experts and psychologists, sometimes this is not a common knowledge, but it's very helpful. It's actually that the white around our iris and our pupil is special. All other animals don't have this very white sclera, it's called. And this helps us a lot doing eye tracking. Even if we do eye tracking with simple cameras like webcams or the smartphone cameras, we do not need the special hardware to do decent eye tracking. Of course, it's better if we use eye tracking with infrared sensors, but this fact is definitely helpful. Other animal eyes, how they look like, and in the compared to other, let's say, animals, not only primates, our vision is kind of mediocre. And so falcons, they have much higher resolutions, maybe, and super high motion vision, and frogs have great sensitivity, and color vision. These are all things where we're not that good, our eyes, but they're good enough for what we have to do. Our attention is very flexible, so we can control it, and it's very adaptive. And we also have a high neural integration, so our emotions and cognitions, they're also very much involved into attention. And literature is amazing on this research, and we're really trying to stay up to date, and also publishing ourselves. So we're able to publish in this book and in one other book that's not on here. And what's so interesting for us, like what Wedel and Peters, for example, say is how eye tracking of consumers, how attention of consumers is actually behaving. And so the very ground eye tracking, like how the light is coming through our optical nerve and where it goes, is not so important for us now. And what's a saccade and a fixation, all these things you are also research professionals, you have already heard before. So I'll kind of skip over these. And what is interesting is still to see how I'll just turn this off again and move. And this video just explains like how information has been processed, and if there's so many competing parts, our brain will select what we shall focus on, and what we select is an individual factor a bit, but it's also very very automated. And in this case, this video was picked because of the little ape here and other things we probably missed. And there's a lot of these examples of how our attention works. And mm, Jabos was one of the first in 1967 who actually measured eye tracking with like some old weird eye tracker, but actually noticed that we get different scan paths depending on the research question. So asking, examine the picture, we'll give you this trace. Estimate the economic level of the people who are in the picture. We'll give you this trace. And so that he was the first to actually notice that eye tracking is even influenced by our research questions. So that's something we should always keep in mind. And in the book that Matthias, Dr. Rotensee, and me wrote a couple of years ago, there will be a new version actually coming out soon. We also said that there's basically three parts of factors that influence our attention. It's the exposure situation. So do I give you control or not? And then we have the factors that we call like top-down, my working memory, and also my motivation. And we have the bottom-up stimulus-driven factors, so saliency, pop out, size and shape. And when you're going into a supermarket and you're hungry, at least for me, that's a no-go. I know my attention will spread very differently, and I will also see and notice other things. And that's more of a top-down. Could also argue maybe it's bottom-up because it's not conscious, but all of these factors doesn't mean that they're conscious. It means just that they're influencing where I'm going to look next and what will come to my consciousness. And um, the the books that we recommend, and that's also why we're here to talk a bit about the theory. In eye tracking for user experience, for example, is a very nice book. Do I need eye tracking in my research? That's the question we always ask ourselves, and we'll also discuss with the client if it's a good add-on for the research question. It's like asking, do I need a microscope? You don't need one to see dust bunnies under your bed, but if you do want to find a dust mite, maybe yes. It all depends on what you're looking for. So we'll get into the do I need part in all of our sessions in this one too. Eye tracking is not useful. I've seen heat maps and that didn't tell me much. Yeah, there's also a lot of bad eye tracking been made, and um, that's a good part. And That's a bit of a funny one. First, this is not a question. Second, eye tracking is so much more than heat maps. And heat maps, we would also argue, don't always sell. Third, whoever gave you a heat map in place of actual data analysis needs to read this book. And how many participants should I get for eye tracking? That 42. No, just kidding. This really depends, and it's not a simple answer. We do eye tracking with like in qualitative research, so n equals 3, and then actually do thinking out loud or retrospective eye tracking. But we also do eye tracking with 1,000 respondents, so that's definitely possible. Wedel and Peter in their book actually said that there's 6 delusions about eye tracking, and people move their eyes consciously. They are aware of it. We see well beyond our point of fixation. We can attend objects even though I'm not looking at it, like overt attention, and um, need to attend to objects only as a precondition for downstream cognitive use. I want only to select objects for attention. So in his book, Visual Marketing, we talk a lot about also shopper research, and that's very interesting. Also, actually scientific studies with how attention and memory or how attention and buying actions come together. And um, so as an outlook for the sessions that we'll do in April and in June, we'll look at the different, let's call them methods or tools. The smartphone eye tracking I already mentioned, head-mounted eye tracking. There's great vendors for this. So we have the Tobii glasses, the pupil invisible, or now the pupil neon, and they're amazing, amazing tools. We totally love these, and we'll show them to you. The webcam eye tracking algorithms, they're pretty similar to the ones we use in the smartphone, and also have become so much better. And desktop eye tracking is like the classic where you have an eye tracker stuck to a screen or integrated in the screen with infrared, either, I don't know how many hertz. They all have, like, you have 200 hertz, 300 hertz. For us in applied research, also the ones with a lot less samples per second, also fine. And then we have the predicted eye tracking, where we use neural networks to predict where the attention will be on an ad. That works great. Even on moving images now, these work great because there's so much training material. But of course, we'll also discuss that. Also, already mentioned the vendors that we work together with for the different purposes, and we'll get into these as well. And these methods we can kind of put into a relation. If we compare precision and budget, desktop eye tracking, head-mounted eye tracking, they used to be, of course, the most expensive ones. So desktop eye tracker, you have to pay like $5,000 to $30,000, and a head-mounted eye tracker you can now get like between $5,000 and $20,000. And of course, these methods are a lot cheaper, but you'll lose precision because they don't have infrared in their setup, and then the eye tracking will not be as good. If we talk about insights, so the level of insights I will get and effort, this is not a perfect setup, but we can say, yeah, of course, the more accurate systems where we can also do automated analysis, which now is also possible with the head-mounted ones. We get a high level of insight. The effort is a bit higher because we have to analyze the data. Normally we would say head-mounted eye tracking was most difficult to analyze because the head movement and people just do what they want, and it's very difficult to detect things within the environment unless you use markers or something. But now this has also changed a lot because of the nice add-ons that Pupil Labs actually puts into their cloud. In UX, if we say there's methods that are behavioral, attitudinal, or qual and quant, we already said that eye tracking is a behavioral method, so they would put it up here. And we would argue it can either be qual or quant, so it doesn't need to be either one. It does, of course, have an also high correlation with attitude, but we wouldn't use it just for pure attitudinal research for associations. And so these remote and wearable eye trackers, we also get into their differences and when to use which. And of course, the remote eye trackers that are connected to a screen, they're easier to use, and they're less obtrusive, right? And we'll show you these different methods in our session then in the next upcoming session. And since we said we'll try to keep it short with these webinars, I'll end here. If you have specific questions about either one of these systems, or if you say like you would like to download one of the white papers, you can certainly do so on our Insight page. You can always reach out to me via LinkedIn or via email as well. We also always like to support bachelor, master, PhD thesis since we have these systems available. Sometimes they're also not in use, so that's why we like to support academia here.